Welcome to Session 5, External Selection. In the last session, we discussed recruiting or filling that pool full of qualified applicants. This week, we'll talk about changing that pile of applicants into a pile of unqualified applicants who will receive no further consideration and a pile of candidates for a job who deserve much consideration. This is the initial screen. Who will survive the initial cut? It's important. If we have 300 applicants, we can't possibly give thorough consideration to that large a number. And likely many of those applicants won't meet even the basic qualifications for the job. I'll point out in the lecture that the danger in the initial review is twofold. First, passing unqualified applicants to the next step of review. And second, rejecting qualified applicants as unqualified due to faulty review or faulty criteria. Therefore, our goal is to reduce our large number of applicants down to a manageable number of fully qualified candidates for our job, using the initial assessment tools defined in the text. Back in the day, when jobs were advertised in newspapers and resumes were sent by mail, I applied for a human resource manager at Carnation in Danville, Virginia. A few weeks later, I received a rejection letter. Now, that was not particularly unusual for me, and I simply filed the letter away in my, quote, rejected file. A month passed, and I received a call from a headhunter I was working with, and he asked if I would be interested in interviewing for a position with Carnation. He stated that I had the exact qualification they required. I affirmed my interest and subsequently interviewed for the position in Danville, Virginia, and at the corporate headquarters in Los Angeles, California. Carnation offered me the position, and I accepted. A few weeks after I started work, I took my rejection letter to my boss who ran the operation and asked if he recognized the letter and his signature. He looked sheepishly at the letter and then at me and said, "Oh my God, we rejected you and then hired you." I asked him how it could have happened that I was unqualified and a month later fully qualified and I hadn't changed a bit. He admitted that he was overloaded with work and didn't really take the time to review the resumes fully and rejected many of them just to get through them, just to get them off his desk. And then the reality of the situation hit him. He rejected a resume that I had submitted in answer to a newspaper ad that was placed by him and the company. He hired me based on the same resume submitted by a headhunter. Therefore, he paid 30% of my first year's income as a headhunter fee for finding me the qualified candidate, and he would have paid nothing had he hired me based on the first resume I submitted and he rejected. Failure to diligently review resumes can be costly. Incidentally, he apologized profusely, and I told him, "That's okay. That's why you need me here, to make sure that nothing like this happens ever again in the future." Never miss an opportunity to articulate your value to your organization. Now, that's a true story, and that's an expensive mistake, but not an uncommon one. Obviously, it's expensive from a financial perspective, but what if we reject an applicant who can make a significant positive contribution to our organization? What if we lose that opportunity? What if the Carolina Panthers rejected Cam Newton on the initial review? For you American Idol fans, what if Carrie Underwood was rejected in the initial review? What if LeBron James was rejected coming out of high school because he was too young and had no college basketball experience? Certainly the cost can be financial, but such errors can be costly in other respects as well. If you don't have the time to effectively select qualified candidates, then simply be prepared to take the time and spend the money later to deal with your mistakes. It's true in life. It's true in business. Do it right the first time. Initial assessments are important. As I stated in the introduction, in the last session, we discussed recruiting methods, or if you will, how to fill our bucket with numerous and hopefully qualified candidates. In this session, we start to deal with making selection decisions. I say start to deal with it because it may be a lengthy process with several related steps. And those steps are designed to narrow down the field until we reach the one, or sometimes more than one, candidate who will receive an offer of employment. Moving from the recruiting process to the selection process is not necessarily a finite or definite point in time. The two activities overlap. First, remember that recruiting is often an ongoing process. We should always be recruiting. But we are only in the selection business when we have an open position and applicants available. Second, if time is critical, we may want to start narrowing down the field before we actually close the search. How can we do this? Well, at each step of the selection process, we must make a decision. Does this candidate move on to the next step, or do we reject this candidate or applicant? And these decisions must be made for each individual applicant, but they don't have to be made at the same time. Some of those decisions are easy because the applicant does not meet basic requirements of the job. But as we narrow further, the decisions become more difficult and carry more risk and consequences. The risk and consequences generally take two forms: passing a bad or unqualified applicant to the next step, and rejecting a good applicant as unqualified. During the early stages of the selection process, passing an unqualified applicant to the next stage is less of a problem than rejecting a good applicant. Passing an unqualified applicant will be corrected at the next step in the process in most cases. But rejecting a good applicant often means they are lost forever. However, the chances of negative consequences in the early stages of selection are not high, but as we progress through our selection process, the chances of such errors are much greater because the differences between candidates are smaller and more difficult to discern. To drive this point further, let me take a few minutes to explain a couple of points in the text. The author covers these points, but I'm not sure they explain it clearly. Our recruiting efforts have created a large pool of individuals who are interested in our company and in our job specifically. We must make our selection decisions from that pool of applicants, and our goal is to choose not just the qualified person to hire, but the most qualified person to hire. How many times have I said that? But at the earliest stages of selection, we really have a large pool composed of clearly qualified people, questionably qualified people, and clearly unqualified people. Therefore, our pool actually consists of people who deserve consideration for our open position and people who just send in a resume hoping for a miracle. Since we are not in the business of granting miracles, we don't want to consider those individuals as candidates for our job. We only want to consider people who meet the basic qualifications as outlined in our job description. And those qualifications must clearly reflect the actual job at hand. Notice something missing? We've talked about KSAOs for the job, but we haven't mentioned where those KSAOs come from. The position qualifications come from a job evaluation and job analysis process. And we'll discuss that process specifically in the latter part of this class when we cover compensation. This represents one of the areas where there's an overlap between staffing, selection, and compensation. So at this point, we're going to assume that the job analysis and evaluation were completed and have formed the basis for valid KSAOs. From our criteria, we can look at resumes and quickly determine if an individual has the required experience, the required education, certifications, if appropriate, etc. If they don't, we do not consider them a candidate for the job. If they meet the basic criteria, they move to the next step of screening and are a candidate. Although it seems simple, this first narrowing attempt is very important. Notice, applicants do not become a candidate for a job until we have determined that they meet the appropriate criteria for the job. That means that those individuals who don't meet the criteria can be rejected without further consideration. We don't have to consider them viable applicants or candidates, and we're released from some of the legal liability or risk. If they complain that they are not given consideration based on race or sex or some other factor, we merely point out that the basic criteria for the job was not met and demonstrate that anyone not meeting the basic criteria was rejected and those who did meet the basic criteria were given further consideration. However, after that decision is made, we have stated that the remaining individuals have indeed become candidates for our open position. The criteria for accepting or rejecting them then becomes more difficult, and the reasons for accepting and rejecting them become less clear. In other words, more subjectivity enters into the process. The authors of the text make this clear delineation between people submitting a resume or application and candidates for the job. In addition, the text also delineates two distinct selection stages: initial assessments and substantive assessments. This chapter covers initial assessments, and substantive assessments will be covered in the next chapter. Once again, initial assessments are now used to narrow down a large pool to a smaller pool of candidates. Initial assessments include resumes, cover letters, application blanks, biographical information, letters of recommendation, references, background checks, and initial interviews. I don't believe the text points this out, but not all of these assessment methods are used in the initial review. How many really depends on the number of applicants. If you receive 25 applicants for the job, you may want to use all or most of these methods. However, if you receive 300 applications, which is not unusual, doing 300 background checks or conducting 300 initial interviews is prohibitive from a financial and a time perspective. The text does a thorough job of covering these methods in any case. The process I've used when reviewing large numbers of applicants include resumes and our application forms, cover letters, biographical information if submitted, and letters of recommendation if submitted. Earlier I stated that at this stage we have a large pool composed of clearly qualified people, questionably qualified people, and clearly unqualified people. The initial assessment is defining which applicants go into which group. Clearly unqualified people, based on the initial assessment, are rejected and don't become candidates. Questionably qualified people may yet become candidates, but their submitted data requires clarification before we can make that determination. And that is generally when I use things such as the initial interview, and it is usually conducted by phone. In the discussion of the logic of prediction, the authors point out that the organization is attempting to predict future performance on the specific job based on information they obtain from each candidate from various assessment tools. The goal of predicting future behavior is good, but it also has limitations. Obviously, one can't predict behavior with 100% accuracy because behavior is situational and it has many variables. But the goal is to get closer and closer to a relatively accurate prediction. Therefore, those applicants who land in the rejected pile have been predicted to not perform well in the job due to lack of qualifications. Those who land in the candidate pile, we predict that they can perform the job based on qualifications. But how sure are we of that prediction? At this point, not very sure. But as we go to the next several steps, which are covered in the next chapter, our confidence becomes greater and greater. And when we make that job offer, we are highly confident that that one person will do very well in the job. In other words, the selection process is not exact. No matter how many assessments you administer, how many references you obtain, how many interviews with an individual you conduct, in the end, someone must make a decision, and some of that decision depends on subjective factors, particularly when you are distinguishing between two or more equally matched candidates. Ultimately, you have to decide from the gut, and that is one of the issues I have with assessment processes. We have become so very sophisticated in assessing behavior that at times we depend on these methods too much, at least in my opinion. I have led and participated in selection processes where hiring managers have asked for just one more test or one more piece of data to validate their impressions. And when that piece of data comes in, they ask for another. I've also had managers review several qualified candidates and come to the conclusion that none, quote, fit in. and asked to start the search all over again. I'll probably say this again in the next lecture covering the next chapter, but someone has to make a decision. The goal of this process is to decide to hire someone. One thing I like about this text is that it presents the tools, identifies the problems and limitations with those tools, and then gives some recommendations for overcoming those problems and limitations. When discussing resumes, the text identifies some tips for getting your resume noticed. On page 118, they state, do not just list your duties, list your accomplishments as well. I've worked with many individuals in developing resumes. Certainly, I emphasize honesty. Never lie on a resume. However, I have found that often individuals don't know how to market themselves and have difficulty identifying accomplishments. In other words, many individuals undersell themselves. It's not as bad as lying, but almost. When asked to list accomplishments, many folks have trouble doing so. I suggest that you sit down and make what I call an accomplishment list. List all of your accomplishments you can think of in chronological order, and as you get closer to the present, list them in a detailed manner. For example, graduating from high school is an accomplishment. Other accomplishments may include athletic awards, educational achievement, other achievement awards, completing a life-saving course, learning a new skill, raising your kids, staying married, sometimes that's really an accomplishment, paying off your car, saving a certain percent of your income, doing volunteer or church work, making a suggestion at work that saves money, a promotion, a letter of recommendation, and on and on and on. Get the picture? Obviously, you won't put these in a resume, but you may use some of these and they may have escaped you otherwise. But this sets the stage for your understanding that you have accomplished much and will focus you on achievement rather than merely doing the job. It changes your focus from duties to accomplishments. And as an employer, I want to hire people who have accomplishments in their past. I have enough people just doing stuff. One day, a young lady showed up in the lobby asking to see me. She stated that she had interviewed for a job but didn't feel she was able to communicate her abilities, attitude toward work, or her motivation. She wanted to show me something that would convince me to hire her. Although suspicious, I agreed to see her, probably because of her innovative and aggressive approach. She came into my office and said at her current employer she made a suggestion that saved time and money. She brought along a prototype to demonstrate her idea and also demonstrate her dedication. In very excited tones, she demonstrated her innovative idea to me and two other managers. We were amazed. We were also very impressed. Even more impressive was that she was applying for an hourly paid position in a manufacturing facility. In my career, I hadn't seen many management candidates show that much initiative and creativity when applying for much higher paying jobs. Oh, and one more fact. She was about 8.5 months pregnant at the time. She ended her presentation by stating that she knew that if we hired her, she would be the best employee in the facility. If we could just wait until she had her baby, we wouldn't regret the wait. And you know what? She was right. We waited and we hired her, and she was certainly one of the best employees in the facility. Be creative, be innovative, be confident, be honest. Sell yourself because there's no one else who can sell you. One other thing you should understand, and here I disagree with the text somewhat. The text states on page 137 that related to initial interviews that at this point applicants are relatively undifferentiated to the organization in terms of KSAOs. That implies that all applicants are looked at in the same manner and everyone starts and stays equal for a time. Applicants are differentiated in the eyes of managers and interviewers, and often for good reasons. I've had managers indicate that they were looking forward to a particular interview because of the background detailed on that resume or in that bio, etc. Those applicants have made an impression before the game starts. So some individuals are differentiated. It is not an equal game throughout, and every selection stage, some are in the lead and some are behind. But as in all endeavors, it is who leads at the end that really counts. Finally, pay particular attention to Exhibit 8.8 on page 140. It does an excellent job of summarizing the initial assessment tools. It's a good review for much of what is discussed in this chapter. Although the initial assessments seem pretty simple, there is much to learn from this chapter. And a lot of what you can learn involves your personal job search. If the initial assessments determine which of the three piles your resume will land in, you must understand that process. Your goal becomes to make sure you land in the qualified group. Make sure you understand the required qualifications for the position. Revise your resume and ensure those qualifications stand out and embellish them to the full extent that honesty allows. Sell yourself honestly and aggressively. Once again, unless you were referred by a headhunter, there's no one else to sell you but you.